We are talking The Gorge from 2025, directed by Scott Derrickson, and this one stars Miles Teller, Anya Taylor-Joy and Sigourney Weaver. And this is an action horror sci-fi movie. The best way I would describe this is think The Last of Us meets Silent Hill meets Sniper, of all things. So the story, without any spoilers, focuses on two snipers, both of which have been selected by mysterious military organisation, and they represent two sides of this gorge. Now, one is controlled by the West, so you have like British or American, one kind of soldier at a time looking after this the west side of the gorge, and then the other is patrolled by an operative selected by the eastern kind of countries like, you know, Russia and stuff. And they basically are sent there to protect anything that comes up from the gorge, and they are told very limited information, just that there is some type of entities that are living in this gorge, and you know, it's described as the possible mouth to hell. Now, they don't know anything other than that. This location is completely secret. You know, not even presidents know that it exists and things like this. And they basically have to have a kind of stay there for a year until they're swapped out for someone else. Now, they're forbidden to contact each other, these two operatives, but inevitably they do, and they actually strike up somewhat of a kind of a romance, either side of this gorge, kind of communicating by handwritten signs and things. But then there are various interactions, so to speak, with these creatures that seem to be coming out of this gorge, and inevitably our protagonists end up in the gorge, where you'll kind of find out a little bit more about what's going on. What will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss. This is kind of a mid-budget sort of action horror film. Obviously, primarily the noticeable thing here is some pretty decent kind of talent in front of and behind the camera. Obviously, Scott Derrickson, a relatively kind of big name director. He's directed Doctor Strange along with some horror, kind of higher profile horror movies. Miles Teller, Anya Taylor-Joy, Sigourney Weaver, all kind of big actors here. And the kind of scope and the kind of the VFX budget is kind of quite big in this movie. So it's certainly not what you would consider a low budget movie. So let's discuss a little bit more detail about what I think works. Now, obviously the upswing of having more veteran, more well-known, more established actors here is the acting is solid. Despite this movie being at its core somewhat of a kind of schlocky B-movie idea, really, nonetheless, I think the acting is solid from pretty much everyone involved in this film. Now, there's not a huge cast. We do get a few kind of bit players here and there. But I gotta say, what really sells the acting for me is the interactions between Miles Teller's character and Anya Taylor-Joy's character. And they have this kind of like subtle sort of flirtation, and you could just feel the chemistry. I mean, these two actors do a fantastic job of, having a huge chasm between them, quite literally, but still being able to have some chemistry between these kind of two characters, even with kind of non-verbal kind of communication. And that is testament to the acting here. So despite this being, yes, it's a relatively kind of schlocky movie in some ways, solid acting and great sort of character work from these performances make these two protagonists definite characters you want to root for and you kind of buy into. So that was all pretty good. Now the idea here, I'm not going to give anything away. The idea here is pure nightmare fuel. When we kind of get into the gorge, I don't want to spoil anything for you, but it is like horrific. And this is very much like as I say, it will remind you of Silent Hill. They're the kind of, our creatures are kind of like, almost like the cordyceps sort of zombie types from The Last of Us, but there's also various other kind of like horrible kind of creepy crawlers and things that this kind of like movie throws up. It is horrific. I mean, in one way, another way I'll kind of try and help you visualize it is think of the Kong Skull Island movie when they're actually in, Skull Island, and you've got all these kind of various kind of beasties and things that are running around. It is horrifying, the design and the ideas here about what's kind of going on. And the movie does actually have, it's not a film that's going to leave you with lots of questions. Everything is kind of explained in a quite interesting way. Relatively obviously. I mean, I don't think it'll take a genius to figure out the kind of what's kind of going on here. But it all sort of makes sense in kind of in relation to the movie. And this film, although it is a kind of a horror movie, certainly in parts, it's also a kind of an action film, and there are lots of kind of like shootouts and fight sequences and stunts and kind of things like that through the movie. And the story itself, it has its schlocky elements, but we love schlocky elements in this channel. So I kind of quite enjoyed this kind of over-the-top adventure that kind of weaves in, horrific horror ideas, but with kind of action movie kind of sentiments, with good quality actors and, some assured and confident direction. So to me, this movie was a really pleasant surprise. I don't really tend to kind of research films too much before kind of watching them. So I knew next to nothing about this movie, and I have to say it was such a kind of like a pleasant surprise to watch, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would recommend this movie. Do I have any critiques? I have a few minor issues with this movie. It's possibly a little bit long. I mean, with credits, it's about 2 hours, 10 minutes. The film running probably about 2 hours. Maybe it could have been about 10, 15 minutes shorter, perhaps. I didn't think it needed to be quite as long, as it is somewhat of a kind of a popcorny film. There are a couple of kind of like logic issues when our characters kind of find out what the kind of the situation is. I think there's some kind of like fairly sort of damning evidence which is kind of just left out for people to find and things. It seems a little kind of short-sighted to a degree, at least. And there's a few kind of like things that are relatively obvious elements here to further the plot, shall we say. We have a kind of a confrontation towards the end of the movie where I felt a certain side came somewhat unprepared, I would say, and I think it would have behooved them to be a bit more forward-thinking about what they were going to do, is all I'm going to say there. And the only other thing I would say is some of the kind of, this is very much a VFX-heavy movie, certainly in the second half of the film. And it's all kind of achieved through CGI. And some of this stuff is horrific, but it does have that sort of CGI sheen to it, which, sometimes makes it feel like a little kind of weightless at times. And ultimately, I think some of that, because this movie is so action heavy, it kind of undercuts the horror just to a degree. And what could have been a truly like terrifying experience plays more like a kind of an action film than really, I think, playing up the more creepier factor. I mean, that was clearly the decision that they wanted to make. But you could have had a genuinely like horrifying hellscape environment here where our characters are really getting psychologically tortured, and there's a degree of that, but I think it's because of the kind of the action sort of sequences and things, it ends up being a bit more of a kind of a shoot 'em up style movie. But they're relatively minor critiques, I'm going to say. I think overall this movie is very well made. It's very popcorny. It's quite sort of obvious, as I say. It's not going to be too surprises here and stuff. But ultimately, it's a hell of a lot of fun, and all around, I think this movie is pretty entertaining on kind of a lot of levels. And it's really capped off by a genuine kind of quite sweet romance, which is played by good actors with good chemistry in a fun kind of action horror scenario. 8 out of 10 for me. Currently my favourite film of 2025, I'm going to say. Have you seen The Gorge? What did you think of it? Please leave me a comment and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.